Hello. Today I'm going to discuss my opinion on the Nintendo Wii. Is it a casual system, hardcore, or both? Well, I could take the easier way out and say that has to do with your preference. But that would make for a pretty boring video. So let's get down to business. Now to begin, what exactly does casual and hardcore really mean? As you all know, sometimes people will try and change the definition of a word in order to support their argument. And sadly, hardcore and casual are two of those words. The bad thing about these words is that before, during the Atari, Nintendo, and Sega days, there was no such thing as casual and hardcore gamers. You're either a gamer, or you weren't. So what brought on these terms, casual and hardcore? Well, in order to find this out, first we must find out the real definitions of hardcore and casual. Let's start with casual. Now I've heard some of the most idiotic things about this word. I've heard that casual has more to do with graphics. I've heard that casual has to do with the lack of adult content. And I've heard that casual has to do with age. All of these are wrong. And my proof is that there are three definitions of it. Hardcore works in the same way. It too is judged by the graphics, adult content, and age group that the game was supposedly made for. So then why have people been using the wrong definitions? Well, that's simple. Because they have been defining the wrong thing. The terms hardcore and casual never meant to define games. They were meant to define the gamers playing them. The terms were dependent on how a gamer played their games. Because of this, any game made can be labeled as casual, depending on if it was a casual gamer that was playing it. And the same can be said about hardcore. So how exactly do graphics become a way for a game to be considered hardcore or casual? And how did Nintendo get the title of casual simply because of its graphics? Nintendo knows exactly what they're doing with the Wii. We know this. With Sony and Microsoft, it was more about building the hardware and letting the developers do the work. With Nintendo, on the other hand, it was about developing the hardware and making the games themselves. This means that Nintendo made the Wii the way it is because they intended on making games look the way they do now. Sure, Nintendo could have done what Sony and Microsoft did and simply make another HD console, with a hard drive and USB ports and what have you. But that would have ended up making the console cost more money, and no longer stand out on its own. One thing you all have to remember about Nintendo is they have already been through the graphics war. You want proof? How many of you know of the Sega Genesis ads? This was the first time graphics had been used over gameplay to support a console. I don't think Nintendo was quite prepared for this, but eventually did counter the Sega Genesis with the Super Nintendo, to show that they too can play the 16-bit graphics game. When the 32-bit consoles were released, Nintendo countered that with the Nintendo 64. So we all know that if they want to, Nintendo can hold their own in the graphics war. So now you should kind of have an understanding of why Nintendo didn't take the HD approach this gen. They simply didn't want to, or need to. We should all know by now that Nintendo has this stuff figured out. I think one problem with the word hardcore is that it seems to be distinguished as the word cool. And when you do that, it makes a game that isn't considered hardcore to be lame. However, the problem with this is hardcore never meant you were cooler. It simply meant you played the same games as everyone else, you just spent more time playing it. Look at games like the original Mortal Kombat. It has blood and fatalities, and something that was never seen before, a mature rating. Now when you're a 9-year-old and you see this, it makes the game feel more fun because A, you're playing something that has blood and fatalities, and B, it has mature rating, meaning that at your age, you have no business playing it. The problem with this, however, is that there's still some adults that still think that playing games with blood and fatalities makes them cool. Come on, you're adults now. Blood and killing has been played out. To look at it now and say, wow, how cool, only makes you look like more of a kid. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have your own taste, but trying to base your cool factor on what games you play. It's understandable that they fooled us with this as kids, but as adults, we should know better. Some people who consider the Nintendo Wii a casual console feel as though Nintendo turned their back on them. But did Nintendo really turn its back on its fans? Or did some of Nintendo's fans turn their back on them? If you really think about it, Nintendo hasn't really changed. Yes, they did bring in another audience, but they didn't take away from what they always did. They simply added on to it. They're still making their Marios, their Zeldas, and their Metroids, like they always did. Just because they made some other games that aren't Nintendo's flagship titles, doesn't mean they just up and left their main audience for another. So remember, it doesn't matter which gaming console you play, or what games you play on it. Your status as a gamer is not based on what games you play, but how much of it you play. So the next time someone tells you you're not a real gamer, based on your preference, you tell them you'll continue enjoying your games, and they can continue trying to look cool, based on what games they play.
Victory. Good work, comrades.